The morning I understood something was wrong in my house, the coffee had already gone cold, and my wife had already stopped asking me what I thought about anything that mattered. It wasn't loud. Nothing in my life ever broke loudly. It started with small exclusions. A chair pushed slightly away from the dinner table. A conversation that stopped the moment I entered the room. My stepmother, Lynn, smiling too quickly when I looked at her, like she was rehearsing normality and afraid I could see the script. I remember sitting in my worn recliner that evening, the old leather cracked at the arms, the ticking clock above the hallway louder than usual. My wristwatch had stopped months ago, but I still wore it out of habit, as if time would behave better if I pretended it still mattered. My wife, Hung, passed behind me without touching my shoulder. That was the first time I felt it clearly. I was no longer part of the emotional geometry of my own home. Something had shifted, quietly, deliberately, and I didn't yet know my stepmother was the one holding the invisible knife. It began weeks earlier, though I only understood that later. Lynn moved into our house after my father died. She was younger than him by almost 20 years, always careful with her voice, always arranging herself like she was visiting rather than belonging. At first, I told myself it was grief, displacement. People behave strangely when they lose the person who defined their place in the world. But grief usually fades. Her presence didn't. It expanded. She started speaking to me more than to my wife, asking small, unnecessary questions about my routine, my work, my habits when I was alone. At first, it felt like polite curiosity. Then it started to feel like measurement. People don't ask questions like that unless they're building a map, and maps are always used for something. The first real crack appeared on a rainy afternoon. I had come home early. The house was unusually quiet, except for the sound of rain tapping against the kitchen window like impatient fingers. I heard Lynn's voice before I saw her. She was speaking softly, but not gently. There was a tone I couldn't place, controlled, intentional, almost rehearsed. When I stepped closer, I stopped at the edge of the hallway. She was standing near the kitchen counter, speaking to whom? My wife's arms were folded, her posture rigid in a way I had never seen before. Lynn said my name, not as a reference, as something she was holding. "I understand him better than you think," she said quietly. "He just doesn't know it yet." Hung didn't respond immediately. That silence told me more than any words could have. I stepped back before I was seen, and for the first time in years, I felt like a guest in my own house. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen long after everyone had gone to sleep. The refrigerator hummed like a tired animal. The clock ticked unevenly. I poured myself tea I didn't drink. I remembered something my father once said, long before Lynn ever entered our lives. Families don't collapse all at once. They rot in places no one looks. I didn't understand it then. I understood it now. Because I could feel something rotting under the surface of every conversation, every glance, every carefully timed silence. And Lynn was at the center of it. The next morning, I noticed my wife avoiding my eyes. Not angrily, carefully. Like she was afraid of confirming something she didn't want to name. I asked her what was wrong. She smiled too quickly. "Nothing," she said. But her hand tightened slightly around her cup when I looked at her. People think lies are loud. They imagine shouting, denial, confrontation. But the most dangerous lies are the ones that sit quietly in a room and let you doubt your own senses. That was what I was starting to feel. Doubt. Not about Lynn yet. About myself. 2 days later, I found a folded piece of paper tucked into the drawer where I kept old receipts. It wasn't mine. My name was written on it in careful handwriting. Not a note. Not exactly. More like a suggestion. A sentence unfinished, as if the rest had been decided elsewhere. I won't repeat what it said, but I remember how long I stood there holding it, listening to the house breathe around me, realizing that someone had been inside my private spaces when I wasn't looking. And worse, they had expected me not to notice. That was the moment something inside me changed. Not anger, clarity. The kind that doesn't announce itself. It just replaces confusion with structure. That evening, Lynn prepared dinner. She moved around the kitchen like she owned its rhythm. My wife helped her, laughing at something I couldn't hear. I sat at the table, watching them. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, when Lynn looked at me directly. No smile, no softness, just assessment. Like I was no longer a person in her eyes, but a position in a plan she was still refining. And then she looked away as if nothing had happened. But I had seen it. And once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. Later that night, I heard voices again. Not loud, controlled, measured. This time, I stayed where I was and listened. My wife's voice was there, hesitant, uncertain. And Lynn's voice, calm, steady, persuasive. Like she had already decided how the story would end, and was simply guiding everyone toward it without resistance. I pressed my hand against the wall. The house felt different under my palm. Not broken yet, but no longer neutral. And then I heard my name again, not spoken with anger. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I wanted to, but because sleep had stopped feeling like rest and started feeling like a pause in something I couldn't control. The house was still dark. That in-between hour where nothing belongs to anyone yet. Even the air feels undecided. I stood in the kitchen without turning on the light and watched the clock above the hallway. Tick, tick. Each sound felt slightly delayed, like the house was listening to me before responding. My wristwatch was still dead. I kept wearing it anyway. Some habits survive even when their meaning doesn't. I noticed the first real shift at breakfast. Hung didn't sit next to me. It wasn't dramatic. She simply chose the chair across from Lynn instead, as if that arrangement had become natural without anyone discussing it. Lynn poured tea for both of them with calm precision. When she spoke, she didn't look at me directly. That was becoming a pattern, avoidance dressed as normality. Some people, she said softly, don't realize how much pressure they put on others just by being present. She smiled after saying it, like it was a harmless observation. But the air changed. My wife didn't respond. She didn't defend me. She just lowered her eyes to her cup. That silence landed heavier than any accusation, because silence, in families, is never empty. It always belongs to someone. And that morning, it wasn't mine. After breakfast, I went outside and stood in the small garden behind the house. The soil was damp from the night rain. A few leaves clung to the stone path, refusing to move even when the wind passed through them. I used to fix everything in this house. Leaks, broken chairs, electrical faults, emotional tensions disguised as ordinary problems. Fixing had been my language. But lately, nothing broke in ways I could repair. Instead, things were being redirected, reframed, rewritten, and I was not being asked to fix anything anymore. I was being observed. Around midday, I saw Lynn talking on the phone near the corridor. Her voice was low, controlled, but I caught fragments. He doesn't see it yet. She's starting to understand. Just give it time. She turned slightly and saw me. Not startled, not surprised, prepared. There are people who act like they've been caught, and there are people who act like you've interrupted something already decided. Lynn belonged to the second kind. She ended the call calmly and smiled. Not warmly, politely, as if I were a distant relative passing through. "Are you resting today?" she asked. The question wasn't concern, it was documentation. I nodded once. She tilted her head slightly, studying me for a second longer than necessary. Then she walked away. And I realized something uncomfortable. She wasn't afraid of being discovered. She was confident I was already too late. That afternoon, I went through old documents. Not because I expected to find anything, but because instinct had started replacing logic. And instinct, once it takes hold, doesn't ask permission. In a drawer I rarely opened, I found copies of household financial records I didn't remember seeing before. My name was still on everything, but something about the structure felt reorganized, like someone had quietly started separating threads in a rope that still looked intact. I sat there longer than I meant to, listening to the house again, listening to what wasn't being said. That evening, my wife finally spoke to me alone. She stood in the hallway, arms crossed tightly, as if holding herself together. "Can we talk?" she asked. The way she said it made it sound like something had already been decided. We sat in the living room, the same room where I used to fix broken furniture, where our children once played, where silence used to mean comfort instead of distance. She didn't look at me immediately. When she finally did, her expression wasn't anger. It was something more dangerous, uncertainty shaped by influence. "Your stepmother," she began slowly. "She's just trying to help this family function better." The word function landed strangely, like we were not a family, but a system that had stopped operating correctly. I asked her what she meant. She hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. Then she said it. "She says you're exhausting everyone without realizing it." No shouting, no confrontation, just a sentence placed gently between us like it had always belonged there. I felt something shift, not in me, but around me, like a foundation had been quietly loosened. Later that night, I saw Lynn sitting alone in the dining room. She wasn't eating. She was simply sitting, hands folded, looking at the empty chair across from her, as if waiting, or measuring absence. When she noticed me, she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she said something softly that didn't belong to the moment. "You've always been good at carrying things," she said. I stopped in the doorway. She continued without looking up. "But not everything is meant to be carried forever." There was a pause, a deliberate one. Then she finally met my eyes, and for the first time, I understood the shape of what was happening. This wasn't a conflict being argued. It was a reality being constructed. Slowly, patiently, inside the people I trusted most. And I wasn't at the center of it anymore. I was becoming the problem it was designed to remove. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark living room, listening to the house settle. Every small sound felt like a decision being made without me. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If a family starts to believe a version of you that isn't real, does it matter what the truth actually is? Or does the version win simply because it is repeated often enough? In the hallway, I heard footsteps pause just outside the door, not entering, not leaving, just waiting. And I realized Lynn wasn't rushing anything. She didn't need to. Whatever she was building was already halfway inside my life. And I still didn't know what the final shape would look like. The first time I realized my own home was no longer neutral, it was because I stopped trusting the sound of footsteps in my own hallway. Not because they were unfamiliar, but because they had started to mean something I wasn't being told. That morning, I stood by the window longer than I needed to. The rain had returned overnight, soft but persistent, turning the garden into something blurred and uncertain. The kind of weather that doesn't announce change, it just slowly rewrites everything it touches. Behind me, the house was already awake, and I wasn't sure what version of myself it had woken up to. I overheard them again before breakfast, Lynn and my wife. Their voices came from the kitchen, calm enough to pass for ordinary conversation. But I had started to understand that ordinary was no longer a reliable category in this house. "You don't need to feel guilty," Lynn said gently. A pause, then my wife's voice, quieter. "I just don't want things to get worse." That sentence should have meant peace, but in context, it sounded like surrender. I didn't enter the room. I stayed where I was and listened to the silence that followed, because silence always reveals what speech is trying to hide. Lynn spoke again, softer this time. "Sometimes," she said, "things don't get worse. They just get clearer." I felt something tighten in my chest. Clarity is not always relief. Sometimes it is exposure. At breakfast, Lynn placed the plates carefully, like she was arranging outcomes instead of food. My wife sat again opposite her. The seat next to me stayed empty. No one acknowledged it. That was becoming the most unsettling part. The way absence was no longer treated as absence. It was treated as intention. Lynn looked at me briefly as she sat down, just long enough for me to notice she was tracking something. Then she spoke. People change slowly, she said, almost conversationally. But environments reveal them faster. My wife nodded slightly. Not agreement exactly, more like conditioning. I set my cup down carefully. The sound felt louder than it should have, and for a moment, no one spoke. That silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. After breakfast, I went to the garage. It was one of the few places in the house that still felt like mine, even if only because no one else had claimed it yet. The faded toolbox sat where I always left it, dust on the lid, familiar weight in my hands when I opened it. I didn't need to fix anything, not yet, but I needed to feel something in my life still responded to me. Inside the garage, the rain outside became distant, muted by concrete and memory. I sat on an old stool and looked at my hands. They used to be decisive. Now they felt observed, like even my stillness was being interpreted by someone else. And I understood something I hadn't been willing to name. A man doesn't lose his place in a family all at once. He loses it in the way people start explaining him to each other when he's not in the room. That afternoon, Lynn asked me to help her with something small, a locked drawer in the storage room. "Your hands are steadier than mine," she said casually. The request was simple, almost meaningless. But meaning wasn't in the request. It was in the timing. I followed her. The storage room smelled faintly of old wood and detergent. Things stored but not forgotten. Boxes stacked in quiet obedience. She stood close enough that I could feel her presence without looking at her. "Here," she said. I opened the drawer. Inside were documents. Not mine, not hers, but arranged in a way that made them feel intentional. She didn't explain them. She didn't need to. Instead, she said something that sounded almost thoughtful. "It's strange," she murmured, "how people assume stability is permanent." I didn't respond, because I could feel it now. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about repositioning. And I was being slowly moved without ever being asked to move. That evening, my wife avoided sitting near me again. Not dramatically, just naturally, like gravity had changed direction and no one discussed it. Lynn sat between us at the dining table, not as a guest, as a stabilizer. She spoke gently throughout dinner, guiding conversation away from me whenever it drifted too close. I noticed it happening. So did my wife. But neither of us interrupted it. That was the most dangerous part. We were all participating now, even in silence. After dinner, I stepped outside. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried its weight. The garden looked slightly different in the dim light, less familiar, more temporary, as if it could be removed without resistance. I stood there longer than I intended, thinking about something my father once said, a memory I hadn't touched in years. When someone starts interpreting your silence for you, you are already losing your voice in their story. I hadn't understood it then. I understood it now, because I could feel my silence being used, not by me, but around me. When I returned inside, I saw Lynn standing alone in the hallway. She wasn't doing anything, just waiting. She looked at me as I approached, not hostile, not emotional, precise. "You're starting to notice," she said softly. It wasn't a question. It was confirmation. I stopped walking. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she added something that felt heavier than anything before. "The question is whether anyone else will notice what you're noticing before it's too late to matter." And in that instant, I realized she was no longer testing me. She was preparing everyone else for a version of me I hadn't agreed to become. The moment I stopped trying to correct what was happening in my house was the moment everything started to move faster. Not because I gave up, because I started observing instead of reacting. And observation, I learned, is something people notice too late, only after it has already changed what it sees. That morning, the house felt quieter than usual. Not peaceful, controlled. Even the sound of the refrigerator clicking on felt deliberate, like it had been allowed rather than happened. Lynn was already awake when I came into the kitchen. She stood by the counter, stirring tea she hadn't yet drunk. My wife sat at the table, scrolling through her phone without really reading anything. No one looked surprised to see me. That was new. Not surprise. Familiarity, as if my presence had become predictable enough to stop registering as an event. "Good morning," Lynn said. Her voice carried the same calm precision as always. But now I could hear something underneath it. Not emotion. Structure. She was building something through repetition. Small phrases, controlled tone, measured pauses. People don't realize how easily a family can be guided by tone alone. Words are not the strongest tool. Certainty is. Breakfast was simple. Too simple. Not in food, but in atmosphere. Conversations were short, efficient, almost curated. My wife spoke about errands she needed to run later. Lynn responded with small affirmations, like she was approving a schedule rather than participating in a conversation. No one asked me anything. Not once. And I realized something unsettling. They weren't excluding me emotionally anymore. They were excluding me functionally. There is a difference. One hurts. The other replaces you. After breakfast, I went to check the mailbox. Old habit. Pointless now, but still mine. Inside, there was a letter I didn't recognize. No return address. Just my name written carefully on the front. My handwriting instincts told me something immediately. This wasn't rushed. This had been written with patience. The kind of patience people use when they believe time is on their side. I didn't open it immediately. I stood there for a long time, holding it, listening to the quiet street outside. A neighbor passed by without greeting me, or maybe I didn't notice if they did. I was starting to understand something about attention. Once you stop receiving it consistently, you begin to doubt whether it was ever there at all. Inside the house, Lynn was in the living room when I returned. She looked up briefly. "I saw the mail," she said casually. Not a question. A confirmation that she had already observed the same thing I was holding. I didn't respond. She smiled faintly, not kindly, not cruelly, just assured. "It's strange," she added, "how people think private things stay private." That sentence landed differently than the others, because it implied reach, not accusation, access. Later that afternoon, I finally opened the letter. It was short, not emotional, not dramatic, but carefully structured in a way that made my stomach tighten, not because of what it said directly, but because of what it suggested had already been decided elsewhere. I read it twice, then a third time, and then I understood the second layer beneath it. Someone was not just speaking to me, they were documenting me. Not as I am, but as I would be described. And those two versions were starting to separate. That evening, my wife didn't come home in her usual time. When she finally arrived, she avoided eye contact. Her movements were careful, like she was stepping into a room where something fragile had already been placed without her knowledge. Lynn greeted her warmly. Too warmly. The kind of warmth that doesn't comfort, it organizes. I watched them talk quietly near the kitchen. I couldn't hear everything, but I didn't need to, because I was starting to recognize patterns instead of sentences, and patterns are harder to argue with. Later, my wife finally came to me, not in the living room, not openly, in the hallway, where conversations feel temporary and deniable. "We should talk less about misunderstandings," she said carefully. The word misunderstandings felt rehearsed, like it had been chosen for her. I asked her what she meant. She hesitated. That hesitation had become familiar. Then she said something I didn't expect. "Lynn thinks you're withdrawing from the family." Not angry, not emotional, just delivered. Like a report. I looked at her for a long moment, and I realized something sharp and uncomfortable. Lynn wasn't accusing me directly anymore. She was distributing perception. That night, I sat alone in the living room. The old recliner creaked slightly when I leaned back. The house was quiet in a way that felt staged. Even the clock seemed slower than before. I thought about something I had once read years ago. A man doesn't lose his family in an argument. He loses it in the stories told about him when he is not present. And I understood then. I was no longer part of the conversation. I was becoming its subject. Footsteps came from the hallway. Slow. Measured. They stopped just outside the door. Not entering. Not leaving. Waiting again. And I knew, without seeing her, that it was Lynn. Because the silence in the house always changed slightly when she was near it. And this time, it felt less like observation and more like preparation for something I hadn't yet been shown. The first sign that I was being pushed out of my own life wasn't an argument. It was a decision I wasn't informed about. I discovered it the way you discover a missing object in your house. You don't notice it directly. You notice the space it used to occupy. That morning, my usual place at the table had been subtly adjusted. Not removed, just displaced. A few centimeters. A small shift in arrangement. But in a house, nothing moves by accident, especially not when Lynn is awake before everyone else. I sat down anyway. No one commented. That was the second sign. My wife glanced at me briefly, then returned to her plate. Lynn served tea with the same calm precision as always, but now I noticed something different in the rhythm of her movements. She wasn't just maintaining order, she was reinforcing it. Like repetition could turn suggestion into belief. "You look tired," she said to me gently. Not concern. Framing. I didn't answer. She nodded, as if my silence confirmed her point. That was something I was starting to understand about her. She didn't need agreement. She only needed absence of resistance. After breakfast, I went to the garage again. The toolbox was still there, but even that felt less certain than before. I opened it slowly, running my fingers over the worn metal edges. My hands remembered tasks my mind didn't feel authorized to perform anymore. Fixing things used to give me clarity. Now clarity was something being taken from me, not restored. I tightened a loose hinge on an old chair out of habit. It didn't need fixing. Neither did I. But I did it anyway, because doing nothing felt like agreeing. Around midday, I heard voices from the living room. My wife and Lynn. I didn't approach immediately. I stayed in the corridor and listened. Not because I wanted to intrude, because I needed to understand whether I was still part of what was being decided inside my own house. Lynn's voice was calm, structured. "My concern is consistency," she said. A pause. Then my wife's voice, uncertain. "I don't want things to escalate." That word again, escalate. As if I were a condition, not a person. Lynn responded softly. "Then we prevent escalation early." Another pause. I realized something uncomfortable. Nothing she said was aggressive. Everything she said was preventive. And prevention is easier to accept than accusation. That's what makes it dangerous. Later, I found my wife alone in the kitchen. She was staring at a cup she wasn't drinking from. I asked her what was going on. She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "I feel like I'm always in the middle of something I don't understand," she said. That was the closest thing to honesty I had heard in days. I asked her who was placing her there. She hesitated again. That hesitation had become a language in itself. Then she said it. "Lynn is just trying to keep things stable." The word stable used to mean safety. Now it felt like containment. That evening, Lynn asked me to join her outside. The garden was damp again. The air carried that quiet heaviness that follows rain but hasn't fully let go of it yet. She stood near the edge of the stone path, hands folded. "You're becoming distant," she said. Not accusation, observation. I looked at her. For the first time, I didn't respond immediately. That pause changed something in her expression. Not fear, interest. Like I had deviated from a script she was still updating. "I'm not distant," I said quietly. She tilted her head slightly. "That's not what others are noticing," she replied. Others. Not my wife. Not me. Others. That word mattered more than anything else she had said, because it revealed scale. I was no longer being evaluated individually. I was being evaluated collectively, and I was losing control over the narrative that surrounded me. That night, I checked the drawer where I had found the previous document. There was something new inside. Another sheet. Same careful handwriting. Same structured tone. But this time, it wasn't just suggestion. It referenced conversations I had not been part of, decisions I had not witnessed, and interpretations I had never agreed to. I stood there for a long time, reading it again and again. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I was trying to understand how it had already become accepted without me. And that's when it hit me. Someone wasn't trying to change how my family felt about me. They were changing how they remembered me. I heard footsteps again in the hallway that night. Slower this time. Closer. They stopped just outside the bedroom door. No knock, no entry. Just presence. And in the silence that followed, I understood something I couldn't ignore anymore. Whatever Lynn was building, it was no longer just influence. It was becoming consensus. And once a consensus forms inside a family, truth stops being the strongest voice in the room. The house changed the way a person changes when they've decided not to argue anymore. It didn't become louder or colder. It became final in small, unspoken ways. Doors were closed a little more firmly. Conversations ended a little earlier. My presence was acknowledged just enough to avoid direct cruelty, but never enough to suggest belonging. That morning, I stood in the hallway longer than I needed to. The air felt arranged. Even the light coming through the window looked slightly staged, like it had been filtered through decisions made without me. At breakfast, Lynn wasn't immediately present. That absence should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like anticipation. My wife sat across from me, stirring her tea slowly. She didn't look up. I noticed her hands were slightly tense around the cup. Not fear, control. People don't realize how quickly emotional tension becomes physical habit. "How did you sleep?" I asked. A simple question. She paused too long before answering. "Fine," she said. But her voice didn't finish the sentence. It stopped early, like something had been edited out. Lynn arrived halfway through breakfast. She didn't apologize for being late. She never did. She simply sat down, placed her hands neatly on the table, and looked at both of us as if continuing a conversation that had started before I entered the room. "I was thinking," she said gently, "we might need clearer boundaries at home." The word boundaries carried weight now, not protection, division. My wife nodded slightly, almost automatically. I watched that movement closely, because it wasn't agreement, it was reinforcement. After breakfast, I followed my usual routine, or what was left of it: the garage, the tools, the quiet repetition of tasks that used to make sense. But today, even the garage felt different, not invaded, reclassified, as if even this space had been mentally reassigned within the house without anyone telling me. I picked up the toolbox and set it down again. No reason, just testing whether the world still responded to my presence in predictable ways. It did not. Around noon, Lynn asked to speak with me alone. We stood in the living room, the same space that once held birthdays, arguments, silence, reconciliation. Now it felt like none of those belonged to it anymore. She spoke softly. "You're making it harder for everyone to feel comfortable," she said. Not anger, not accusation, fatigue disguised as logic. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I asked, quietly, "Everyone?" She nodded. That single word again. It wasn't about truth. It was about majority perception. And majority perception, once established, becomes indistinguishable from reality inside a household. I realized something then. Lynn wasn't trying to convince me. She had stopped needing that. She was shaping agreement elsewhere, in small private conversations, in pauses I wasn't present for, in interpretations I couldn't hear but was already being defined by. That's when I understood the structure of it. A family doesn't need to be told what to believe. It only needs repeated reassurance until doubt feels antisocial. That afternoon, I tried speaking to my wife directly. We sat in the kitchen. No Lynn. Just us. At least, that's what I thought at first. But even absence can feel occupied. "I want to understand what's happening," I said. She didn't look at me immediately. When she did, Her expression was tired in a way I hadn't seen before. "I don't know anymore," she admitted. That was new. Honesty, but incomplete. Then she added something that changed the air between us. "Lynn says you've been emotionally unpredictable lately." The word unpredictable landed heavier than anything else, because it wasn't about actions, it was about interpretation. And interpretation, once accepted, becomes identity. I asked her if she believed that. She hesitated, longer than before, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Not agreement, but exposure to repetition. That evening, I noticed something missing. The photograph in the hallway, the one from years ago. My father, Lynn, me. A moment that used to represent continuity. It was gone. I asked my wife casually. She paused. "I think Lynn moved it," she said, like it was a small organizational choice. Not removal, repositioning. I walked through the hallway again. The empty space where it used to hang felt louder than the picture ever did. Later, Lynn and my wife were in the living room again. I didn't approach immediately. I stopped at the corridor and listened. Lynn's voice was calm. "This isn't about blame," she said. A pause. "It's about what's healthiest for everyone involved." My wife didn't respond immediately. Then quietly, "I just don't want conflict anymore." That sentence wasn't directed at me, but it didn't need to be, because it defined the environment I was now living inside. A place where avoiding conflict had become more important than identifying truth. That night, I found another note. Different placement this time, on the inside of a kitchen drawer. Same handwriting, same structure. But now it referenced something new, a decision, not suggested, not implied. A decision that seemed to assume my consent had already been removed from the equation. I stood there for a long time, reading it until the words stopped feeling like language and started feeling like architecture. Something was being built around me, not loudly, not violently, but with enough agreement from others that resistance no longer mattered. And when I finally turned off the kitchen light, I noticed something that stayed with me longer than anything else that day. No one asked where I was. No one noticed I had been standing there. And for the first time, I understood the direction this was heading. Not toward confrontation, not even toward separation, but toward replacement of presence with assumption. And assumption, once accepted, does not need the original person anymore. Footsteps again in the hallway. This time, they didn't stop. They passed my door, slow, certain, as if whatever conclusion was being reached didn't require me to be included in it anymore. The first thing I noticed that morning was not what had changed in the house, but what had stopped changing in relation to me. The air no longer adjusted when I entered a room. It simply continued, as if I had become irrelevant to its flow. I stood in the hallway for a long moment before breakfast, watching light shift across the floorboards. The house used to feel like it reacted to my presence. Subtle sounds, small acknowledgments, a sense of shared space. Now, it felt like everything had already decided how it would behave without consulting me. At the table, Lynn was already seated. My wife joined a moment later. Neither of them looked surprised that I arrived. That absence of reaction had become its own form of communication. Lynn poured tea slowly, carefully, as always. But today, there was something slightly different in her timing. A pause just long enough to feel intentional. "I've been thinking about household structure," she said. The phrase sounded neutral, but nothing she said was neutral anymore. My wife nodded faintly before she even finished the sentence. That small delay, before comprehension, was disappearing, replaced by anticipation of agreement. I spoke carefully. "What structure?" Lynn looked at me for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Clarity," she said. "So there's less confusion about roles." Roles. That word stayed in the air longer than the rest of her sentence, because it implied something already rewritten, not discussed, reassigned. My wife didn't look at me when she spoke. "I think that would help," she said quietly. Not conviction, alignment. That difference mattered more than it should have. After breakfast, I went to the garage again. But even there, something had shifted. A box had been moved slightly. Not removed, not taken, just repositioned in a way that suggested someone else had been organizing the space. The realization was small, but it carried weight. My environment was being quietly managed without my involvement, and I wasn't being asked why. Because asking would imply I still had authority over it. I sat on the stool and opened the toolbox. The tools were still mine, but the meaning of using them had started to feel uncertain. Fixing things used to restore order. Now order was being defined elsewhere. I tightened a loose screw on an old hinge again. The repetition wasn't about repair anymore. It was about memory, a reminder that I still existed in physical form, even if my role was changing. That afternoon, Lynn asked me to sit with her in the living room. My wife was not present. That detail mattered, because it was becoming rare. She placed a folder on the table between us, not aggressively, not secretly, just deliberately. "I want us to avoid misunderstandings," she said. I looked at the folder but didn't open it immediately. "Misunderstandings," I repeated quietly. She nodded, then added gently, "Between how things are meant to be and how they're being perceived." Perception again, not truth, not action, perception. That was her real language. I opened the folder. Inside were printed pages, notes, fragments. Statements arranged in a way that suggested coherence had already been assigned to them. I recognized some of the content, but not the context she had placed them in. That was the shift. It wasn't about what had happened. It was about what it was being made to mean. I closed the folder slowly, and I understood something I hadn't fully admitted until now. Lynn wasn't rewriting events. She was rewriting causality. That evening, my wife avoided sitting next to me again. But this time, she looked more conflicted than before, as if proximity itself had become a decision she wasn't sure how to make. Lynn spoke calmly throughout dinner. Her tone never changed, but her influence did not need variation. It only needed repetition. At one point, she said softly, "Some patterns are easier to see from the outside." No one responded, but I felt the sentence land differently than the others, because it positioned me as the pattern, not the observer. Later that night, I stood alone in the kitchen. The clock ticked steadily above the hallway. The house felt quieter than usual, but not empty, occupied in a different way, not by people, by narrative. I opened the drawer where the notes had appeared before. There was something new again, but this time, it wasn't just documentation. It was instruction. Not direct, not forceful, but structured in a way that assumed compliance had already been established. I read it once, then again, and I realized something unsettling. There was no longer a conversation happening in this house. There was only alignment being refined. Footsteps came from the hallway again, slower than before. Then they stopped. Not outside my door this time, but somewhere closer to the center of the house, where decisions used to be shared. And I understood, with a quiet clarity I couldn't ignore anymore. I was no longer being pushed out through conflict. I was being replaced through consensus. And consensus does not announce itself. It simply becomes the only version of reality people agree to live inside. That morning, I woke up before the house did. But for the first time, it didn't feel like I had woken first. It felt like I had been left behind. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was organized, layered, as if the house had already started its day without informing me of my role in it. I stood in the kitchen in the dark, not turning on the light immediately. The clock above the hallway kept ticking with the same steady patience it always had. But now I noticed something I hadn't before. It didn't feel like time passing. It felt like time confirming something already decided. When I finally sat at the table, Lynn was already there. That had become normal. Too normal. My wife arrived shortly after, her movements careful, measured. She didn't look at me directly, but she didn't avoid me either. That middle space, between acknowledgement and avoidance, was becoming the most dangerous place in the house. Lynn poured tea. Her voice was calm. "I think we're reaching a point where we need consistency," she said. The word consistency had started replacing every other explanation. My wife nodded before the sentence finished. Not agreement with content, agreement with direction. That distinction mattered more each day. After breakfast, I went outside earlier than usual. The garden was damp again, the soil darker, heavier, as if it remembered every conversation that had ever passed through the house. I stood near the edge of the stone path, watching nothing in particular. There was a time when I would have checked the fence, adjusted the gate, fixed something small just to feel the world respond to me. But nothing felt responsive anymore. Only observant, like the house itself had turned into an audience. When I returned inside, I noticed Lynn speaking quietly to my wife near the hallway. They stopped talking the moment I appeared. Not abruptly, smoothly, as if my presence had been anticipated. That small coordination told me more than the conversation itself. I didn't interrupt. I simply walked past them. And I felt it again, that shift. Not tension, adjustment. Like I was a variable the room recalculated around automatically. Later, Lynn asked me to sit with her in the living room. She didn't bring a folder this time. That absence felt deliberate. Instead, she placed a simple cup of tea on the table between us. "I want to be honest with you," she said. Her tone was softer than usual. That alone made me more alert, because softness, from her, was never accidental. "It's becoming difficult for your wife," she continued. I didn't respond. She nodded slightly, as if my silence confirmed something she already believed. "She feels caught between two versions of reality," Lynn said gently. That phrase stayed in the air longer than the rest. Two versions. Not truth and lie. Versions. That was her strategy now, to turn reality into plurality, and plurality into confusion. That evening, I noticed something missing again. A small object from the living room shelf. Not valuable, not important in any practical sense, but familiar. I asked my wife casually about it. She paused, then said, "Lynn said it was cluttering the space." Cluttering. A word that removes meaning without argument. I looked at the empty spot longer than I intended. Because it wasn't about the object. It was about the ease with which absence was being normalized. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room. The recliner felt slightly different under my weight. Or maybe I was different under it. The house was quiet, but not still. There was movement in the silence now. Decisions being finalized without speech. I thought about something I hadn't fully accepted until this moment. A family doesn't always break. Sometimes it reorganizes itself around a new center of gravity. And what used to be the center becomes something to be managed. Footsteps in the hallway again. This time, they didn't pass. They stopped. Just outside the living room. No knock, no entry, only presence. And I understood, without needing to see her, that Lynn was standing there again. But this time, it didn't feel like she was watching me. It felt like she was confirming something had already been completed elsewhere, something I had not been invited to witness. And for the first time, I realized I was no longer part of the process, only the outcome. That morning, the house felt like it had already chosen a direction before I even opened my eyes. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just quietly, like a decision made overnight that no one needed to announce anymore. I stood in the kitchen longer than usual, watching the light stretch across the table. It didn't feel like morning beginning, it felt like something continuing without me. At breakfast, Lynn was speaking before I even sat down. Not to me, around me. That was the shift I couldn't ignore anymore. Her voice was calm, almost conversational. "I think we all agree things have been tense," she said. My wife gave a small nod, not directed at me, at the idea. That distinction had become important. Lynn continued gently. "It's not about who is right. It's about what keeps the household stable." Stable again. That word had become a lever. My wife didn't look at me when she spoke. "I just want peace," she said quietly. Peace. But peace, I was starting to realize, was being defined without me included in its meaning. After breakfast, I tried something simple. I spoke directly to my wife. No interruption, no Lynn in the room. Just the two of us in the hallway. "Do you trust what's happening here?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes moved slightly downward, as if searching for a version of the answer that wouldn't create tension. I trust that Lynn is trying to help, she said. That wasn't an answer to my question. It was a replacement for it. And that was new. Not denial. Substitution. I stepped outside afterward. The garden looked unchanged, but I no longer trusted that. Even unchanged things felt curated now. The wind moved through the trees softly, without urgency. I thought about how easily a person can become the only one in a room who remembers how things used to feel, and how lonely that kind of memory becomes when no one else can confirm it. When I returned inside, Lynn was waiting near the living room, not blocking, not approaching, just positioned, as if she had already decided where I would pass through her awareness. "You seem distant today," she said. It wasn't a question, it was labeling. I stopped walking, looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't respond immediately. That pause changed the air, not in a visible way, in a structural way. She noticed it, of course she did, but she didn't react. She adjusted. That was her strength. That afternoon, I found my wife alone in the kitchen again. She was staring at the counter, not moving. I asked her what she was thinking. She hesitated, longer than before, then said quietly, "I don't recognize how we talk anymore." That was the closest thing to truth I had heard in days. Not accusation, disorientation. I asked her if she felt safe here. She looked up at me for a moment, and in that moment, I saw something fractured. Not fear, confusion shaped by repetition. "I feel like I'm always being told what's happening," she said softly, "and I don't know what I actually think anymore." That sentence stayed in the air after she stopped speaking, because it wasn't about me. It wasn't about Lynn. It was about erosion. That evening, Lynn asked me to sit with her again. This time, there was no tea, no folder, just space between us. "I think you're resisting something that doesn't need resistance," she said gently. I looked at her. For a moment, I didn't speak. Then I asked quietly, "What exactly am I resisting?" She paused, just long enough to make the pause intentional. "Change," she said. But the way she said it suggested something deeper. Not change happening, change already completed. That night, I sat alone in the living room longer than usual. The clock ticked steadily above the hallway. I noticed something strange in how familiar sounds had started to feel unfamiliar when no one acknowledged them anymore. The house wasn't louder or quieter, it was reframed, as if every sound now belonged to a different interpretation, and I was no longer part of that interpretation. Footsteps again. But this time, they didn't stop outside the room. They moved past it, slow, certain, not searching, confirming. And I realized something I couldn't ignore anymore. Whatever Lynn had been building wasn't approaching completion. It had already crossed a threshold, and I was only now beginning to understand what had been decided without me. That morning, I understood something before anyone even spoke. The house no longer needed to convince me of anything. It had moved past persuasion. It was operating on acceptance, just not mine. The air felt heavier in the kitchen, not because anything had changed physically, but because everything now felt finalized in a way no one was discussing. Even the way chairs were placed looked intentional, as if yesterday's arrangement had been reviewed and approved overnight. Lynn was already seated when I arrived. My wife came in shortly after. Neither of them paused when I sat down. That absence of reaction used to bother me. Now it simply clarified things. Lynn spoke first, as usual. "I think we've reached a point where we need fewer emotional interpretations," she said calmly. My wife nodded almost immediately. Not agreement with content, agreement with tone. That had become the pattern. Tone first, meaning later, or meaning never. I asked quietly, "Interpretations of what?" Lynn looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, then answered gently, "Of intentions." That word stayed between us longer than the rest. Intentions. Because intentions are impossible to prove and easy to redefine. My wife didn't look at me when she spoke. "I just don't want stress anymore," she said. Stress. Not truth, not conflict. Stress. A word that flattens everything it touches. After breakfast, I stayed in the kitchen longer than usual. Not because I needed anything, because leaving felt like agreeing to something I hadn't been told. The sink dripped once, then stopped. Even that felt coordinated. Like the house was demonstrating how silence should behave. Later, Lynn asked me to sit with her in the living room. No tea this time, no documents, just direct conversation, which was new, and therefore more dangerous. "You're becoming difficult to place within the household dynamic," she said. "Not emotional, technical." I looked at her. "Place?" I repeated quietly. She nodded. "As in, how your presence affects others." That framing was deliberate. Not what I do, what I cause. That distinction is everything. My wife entered the room halfway through the conversation. She didn't interrupt, she simply sat down, and that alone changed the structure of the moment. Now it wasn't a dialogue, it was alignment. Lynn continued calmly. "I think it would help everyone if expectations were clearer." No one asked what expectations meant, because in that environment, meaning was no longer negotiated, it was absorbed. That afternoon, I walked outside alone. The garden felt unchanged again, but I no longer trusted stability as a visual signal, because I had learned something uncomfortable. The most controlled environments always look the most normal. I stood near the stone path, thinking about how quietly people can be reclassified inside their own lives. Not removed, repositioned, until even their memory of importance begins to fade. When I returned, I noticed something new. A box in the hallway. My things. Not packed, not thrown, just gathered. Neatly. Like someone had begun preparing space without announcing why. I didn't open it. I already understood what it meant, even if no one had said it directly. That evening, Lynn spoke to my wife in a low voice near the kitchen. I didn't hear everything, but I heard enough. "It will be easier once the adjustment is complete." Adjustment. Not conflict, not separation. Adjustment. My wife didn't respond immediately. When she did, it was barely audible. "I just want things to stop feeling confusing." Confusing. That word again. Not painful, not wrong, just confusing. And confusion, once accepted as normal, becomes permission for others to decide clarity on your behalf. That night, I sat alone in the living room longer than I meant to. The house felt quieter, but not empty. More like something had been removed from it without disturbing its structure. The clock above the hallway kept ticking, but now it felt less like time passing and more like time concluding. Footsteps again. But this time, they didn't stop. They moved toward the center of the house, where conversations used to be shared equally. And I realized, with a slow, unsettling clarity, I was no longer being positioned within the house. I was being positioned outside of its decisions. And that meant the decisions were already complete. That morning, I woke up to a silence that felt too organized to be natural. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of unexpected sound. Even the small imperfections of daily life seemed corrected in advance, as if the house had already decided how the day should behave before anyone entered it. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, realizing something uncomfortable. A place doesn't need to change physically to feel like it no longer belongs to you. It just needs to stop responding to you. When I entered the kitchen, Lynn was already speaking. Not loudly, not urgently, just continuously, like she had never stopped from the night before. My wife sat across from her, hands folded around a cup she wasn't drinking from. Neither of them acknowledged my arrival immediately. That delay used to feel accidental. Now it felt procedural. Lynn finally looked up. "We've been thinking about practical adjustments," she said. My wife nodded faintly. Adjustments again. That word was starting to replace every other form of explanation in the house. I asked quietly, "Adjustments to what exactly?" Lynn didn't answer immediately. She chose her words carefully. "To reduce tension," she said, then added, almost gently, "Everyone has noticed it." Everyone. That word had become the most powerful tool in the house. because no one ever defined who everyone was, but everyone still carried weight. My wife didn't look at me when she spoke. "I just want things to feel normal again," she said. Normal. As if normal had not already been redefined without my participation. After breakfast, I went to the garage. The toolbox was still there, but something about it felt less certain now. Not physically, symbolically. As if even the objects I used to define myself with were waiting for permission I hadn't been given. I picked up a wrench and held it for a long moment. It still had weight, still had function. But meaning had started to drift away from function, and that was new. Later, Lynn asked me to sit with her alone again. The living room felt brighter than usual, though I couldn't tell if the light had changed or my perception had. She placed nothing on the table this time. No folder, no tea, just presence. "I want to be clear with you," she said softly. That sentence carried more weight than before, because clarity, in her language, had started to mean conclusion. She continued, "This situation is affecting your wife more than she admits." I didn't respond. She watched me carefully, not waiting for emotion, waiting for resistance. My wife entered halfway through the conversation. She didn't interrupt, she simply sat down again. That action alone confirmed something I had been noticing for days. Her presence was no longer independent, it was responsive. Lynn spoke calmly. "I think it would be healthier if we reduced overlapping emotional pressure points." Overlapping emotional pressure points, a phrase that turned family into system design, not relationships, structures. That afternoon, I found something new in the hallway, a second box, smaller than the first, more deliberate. Inside were items I used regularly, not discarded, just removed from use, placed together as if waiting for reclassification. I stood there for a long time before touching anything, because I understood now. Nothing was being taken from me. It was being redefined as no longer necessary. That evening, I heard Lynn and my wife again in the kitchen. Their voices were softer than before, more aligned, less negotiation, more confirmation. "Once things settle, it will feel easier," Lynn said. Settling, not resolution, settling, as if everything was being allowed to sink into its final position. My wife responded quietly, "I don't want to think about it anymore." That sentence mattered more than the others, because it wasn't agreement, it was surrender of processing. And once someone stops processing, they stop questioning. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room. The clock ticked steadily above the hallway, but it no longer felt like time moving forward. It felt like time confirming what had already been decided. I thought about something I hadn't fully understood before. You don't need to be removed from a family to disappear from it. You only need to stop being the reference point. And once that happens, everything continues as if you were never the center at all. Footsteps again. This time, they passed behind me without stopping. Not toward me, not away from me, just continuing through the house as if I were no longer part of their path. And in that moment, I understood something I couldn't unsee. The decision was no longer forming. It had already been made. I was only still living inside its aftermath, without knowing where it ended. That morning, I stopped trying to read the house the way I used to, because I finally understood something I had been avoiding for too long. It was no longer speaking to me in words. It was speaking around me, as if I had become a fixed object inside a system that no longer needed feedback from me. I stood in the kitchen without turning on the light, listening to the refrigerator hum, the distant movement of someone upstairs, the soft settling of the house into its daily pattern. None of it acknowledged me, but all of it continued. That difference mattered now. At breakfast, Lynn was already mid-conversation with my wife when I entered. Not waiting, not pausing, continuing. That alone told me everything about where I stood in the structure of the morning. "You don't need to carry that part anymore," Lynn was saying gently. My wife nodded, slowly, relieved. Not because she understood, because she was accepting release from something she no longer wanted to examine. When I sat down, neither of them reacted, not even briefly. That absence of reaction wasn't neutrality anymore, it was placement. Lynn finally looked at me. Her expression was calm, almost patient. "We've been discussing workload balance at home," she said. Workload. Not emotions, not relationships. Workload. My wife didn't look at me when she spoke. "I think that would help everyone," she said quietly. Everyone again. That word had become the shield behind every decision. And shields don't need truth, only acceptance. After breakfast, I didn't go to the garage immediately. Instead, I stood in the hallway longer than usual. There was a sound upstairs, light movement, a drawer closing softly. Ordinary sounds, but now they felt distributed, as if each sound belonged to a different decision I hadn't been included in. I realized something simple but unsettling. The house still functioned perfectly without my input. That realization was not loud, but it was irreversible. When I finally went to the garage, I noticed the toolbox had been moved again. Not far, just enough to signal awareness of its existence without requiring my involvement. I opened it slowly. The tools were still there, but I found myself thinking less about what they could fix and more about what they no longer represented. Fixing assumed participation, and participation was no longer being requested. Later, Lynn asked me to join her outside. The garden looked unchanged again, but I no longer trusted unchanged things. She stood near the edge of the stone path, hands folded in front of her. "I want to make something clear," she said softly. That phrase had changed meaning over time. Clarity no longer meant understanding, it meant final framing. She continued, "You're creating more instability than you realize." I looked at her, and for the first time, I noticed something different in her tone. Not emotion, not conflict, completion. Like she had moved past persuasion entirely. My wife joined us halfway through. She didn't look uncertain anymore. That was new. Uncertainty had been replaced with something quieter. Alignment without explanation. Lynn spoke gently. "We're trying to make this environment healthier for everyone." No one asked what healthier meant anymore, because meaning was no longer being negotiated. It was being received. That afternoon, I opened the second box in the hallway again, this time more slowly. Inside were items that had once defined routine parts of my day, not removed out of anger, removed out of reclassification. I sat on the floor beside it for a long time, not because I was shocked, because I was observing something I couldn't reverse. A life being gradually edited without visible resistance. That evening, I tried speaking to my wife alone. We sat in the kitchen. For a moment, it felt like the house had stepped back slightly. I asked her a simple question. "When did things change?" She hesitated, longer than before, then said quietly, "I don't think it changed all at once." That answer should have been vague, but it wasn't. It was honest in a fragmented way. She continued, "It just became easier not to question it." That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else she had said, because it wasn't about influence, it was about fatigue. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room again. The clock ticked steadily above the hallway, but I noticed something new about it now. It didn't feel like it was measuring time anymore. It felt like it was marking completion stages of something I hadn't agreed to participate in. The house was still functioning, still speaking, still deciding. But not with me, only around me. Footsteps again. This time they stopped in the hallway. Not outside a door, not near a room, just in the space where decisions used to pass through before becoming action. And I understood, with a quiet certainty I couldn't shake. Whatever Lynn had built was no longer being prepared. It was already in place, and I was now simply living inside its finished version. That morning, I realized something simple, so simple it almost felt late. No one was waiting for me to participate anymore. Not in conversation, not in decisions, not even in disagreement. The house had already learned how to proceed without requiring my emotional input. And that, more than anything, is how a person disappears while still standing in the same room. At breakfast, Lynn didn't begin with any framing or explanation. That was new. She had stopped preparing conversations. She was now delivering conclusions. "We've made some progress," she said calmly. My wife nodded once, not toward me, not toward Lynn, toward the idea of progress itself. I sat down, and for the first time, no one adjusted their behavior in response, not even slightly. That absence of adjustment felt louder than any argument. Lynn continued, "I think we can all agree things feel more structured now." Structured. Not better, not worse, just structured. My wife finally spoke, quietly. "It feels less stressful." That word again, stress. The universal justification for everything that had been removed, repositioned, or redefined. I asked softly, "Less stressful for who?" No one answered immediately, not because they were avoiding it, because the question itself no longer fit the framework of the conversation. After breakfast, I didn't go to the garage. I stayed in the hallway instead, watching the house move around me without interruption. Footsteps upstairs, a drawer closing, water running briefly in the kitchen. Each sound was normal on its own, but together, they formed something I couldn't ignore anymore. A system functioning without requiring acknowledgement of its origin. When Lynn found me standing there, she didn't ask what I was doing. She simply observed me for a moment, then said, "You seem quieter lately." Not concern, documentation. I nodded slightly. She added, almost gently, "That can be a good sign." I asked her what she meant. She smiled faintly. "When conflict stops needing your participation." That sentence should have sounded peaceful, but it didn't. It sounded like exclusion that had learned to describe itself as relief. My wife joined us in the hallway. She paused briefly, looking between us. There was something in her expression now that I hadn't seen before. Not confusion, not alignment. Something closer to resignation that had become routine. "I think I understand things better now," she said quietly. Not explained, understood. That distinction mattered, because understanding doesn't require accuracy, only acceptance. Later, I found the first box had been moved again, this time closer to the front door. Not hidden, not displayed, positioned. That word kept returning in different forms. Everything was being positioned now, even absence, especially absence. I stood there longer than I meant to, because I understood what proximity to the door implied without anyone saying it. Not removal, transition. That evening, Lynn spoke with my wife alone in the living room. I didn't join them, but I didn't need to hear the conversation anymore to understand its direction. I had learned how this worked now. Language was no longer used to explore meaning. It was used to confirm alignment. When my wife came out afterward, she avoided eye contact for a moment, then said quietly, "We're all trying to adjust." Adjust again. Always adjust. Never restore. Later that night, I sat in the living room while the house settled into its quiet rhythm. The clock above the hallway continued ticking, but I no longer experienced it as time passing. I experienced it as structure confirming itself. Each tick felt less like movement forward and more like a finality being reinforced. Footsteps again, but this time they didn't circle the house. They stopped directly in the center of the hallway, not near me, not away from me, just at the point where everything in the house seemed to converge. And I realized something I couldn't unthink. The house no longer needed to decide what I was. It had already finished deciding. Now it only needed time to align everything else around that decision. That morning, no one spoke before breakfast. Not because there was tension, but because speaking no longer felt necessary to initiate anything. The house had settled into a rhythm that didn't require permission anymore. And I had stopped expecting my presence to alter it. That realization didn't arrive with emotion. It arrived with clarity. Lynn was already at the table when I came in. My wife followed a moment later. No one acknowledged the silence between us, because silence had stopped being a gap. It had become the structure itself. Lynn finally spoke. "I think we can conclude the transition phase is complete." The word conclude felt deliberate, final. My wife didn't react immediately, then nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something she had already accepted privately. I asked quietly, transition to what? Lynn looked at me for a long time, not sharply, not emotionally, just with the calm of someone confirming a map is accurate. To stability, she said. That word again. But now it didn't feel like justification. It felt like destination. My wife didn't look at me when she added softly, it feels calmer this way. Calmer. Not better, not worse. Just calmer. After breakfast, I didn't move. Not to the garage, not outside, not anywhere. I stayed seated while the house continued around me. Footsteps upstairs. A drawer closing. The faint sound of water running. Everything functioning. Everything continuing. Without requiring me. And for the first time, I understood something completely. A person doesn't need to be removed from a home to become unnecessary inside it. They only need to stop being required for its emotional balance. Lynn stood near the hallway when I finally rose. She didn't block me. She didn't guide me. She simply watched. I hope you understand, she said softly. This was never personal. That sentence should have meant reassurance, but it didn't, because it removed intention. And without intention, everything becomes structural. My wife stood behind her, silent, not afraid, not aligned, just present in a way that no longer included me as reference. I walked through the house slowly. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway. Spaces that used to feel like extensions of memory now felt like documented areas I had passed through at some point, in a process I didn't fully witness. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. The second box was gone. So was the first. Not thrown away, not left. Removed. And I didn't know when. That was the detail that stayed with me. That evening, I stood at the front door longer than usual. No one asked where I was going. No one stopped me. Not because they didn't care, but because the question no longer had relevance inside the system the house had become. I placed my hand on the door, paused, listened. Behind me, I heard Lynn's voice one last time. Soft, controlled, almost reflective. Some people only realize they were the foundation after everything stays standing without them. I didn't turn around. I opened the door. Cold air outside. Stillness. No urgency. And just before I stepped out, I heard something behind me. A chair shifting slightly in the dining room. Not dramatic, not final, just continuing, as if the house had already resumed its version of normal, without waiting for me to decide whether I was part of it. And I never turned back to see if anyone was watching, with intent. That was when I realized the most dangerous thing about Lynn wasn't what she said to me. It was what she was convincing everyone else to believe about me. And I finally understood. This wasn't confusion. It was a strategy. A slow, invisible replacement of my place in my own marriage. And I was already behind in ways I couldn't yet measure.